Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this lovely Cannondale Evo. This is sitting on Sram. We're going to service this bike. We're going to replace the rear brake cable, the chain, the cassette. And this is a typical kind of service that we do in our shop day in, day out. So this customer brought this bike in for service and we bring it to you. I also had this issue with the rear brake cable. I never actually noticed this when the customer brought this bike in, but we removed that tape. I noticed that as I was starting the service, thought what's going on under there, and found this broken outlet on the cable. It's through the steering. Every time that handlebars are turning left and right, it's putting tension on there. So we contacted the customer and we're going to address that cable as well. You can see here the chain is completely worn out. It needs a new chain, it needs a new cassette on the back of that chain wearing the cassette. So we'll also do that during this service. But later on in the video, I found a fault with this bike that actually is a very small problem that can cause major problems. So stick around for that as we go. We'll show you that along the way. So out come the wheels. With all the services I do, we strip the bike down, we bring down the components that we want to clean and lubricate and get the bike to a state where we can actually service the components that are on it. You can see there's quite a build-up of oil and debris on the cassette itself. Now fortunately we were replacing that, so we didn't need to clean that up, but it shows how the grime builds up on a bike over time. So I'm now going to take the rear derailleur off. I was able to keep the cable. There was nothing wrong with the shifting on this bike. The cables were fine, but you can see here on the jockey wheels that build up of debris. That will only continue and gradually get to the stage where that will wear the chain very rapidly. It acts like a bit of sandpaper, doesn't promote smooth shifting, and in general we want to keep that clean and tidy. So as part of this service we will clean the jockey wheels. Off comes the front derailleur now. It has a little chain catcher on there which we need to take off, and you can see there again we've got that grime build up beginning on the plates of the derailleur, so we will clean that off. That will again help with smooth shifting and make sure that component doesn't wear the chain or itself because of that pasty grime on there. Now I'm taking off the pedals. In this instance I want to take the crankset off of this bike, so I'm removing the pedals to make that a little bit easier for me, and obviously remove the left hand crank arm. Now these crank arms on the Cannondales have a proprietary fit in here, a special tool that is a Cannondale tool, so we have to put the extractor inside, then the bolt cover, and extract the pedal arm using that tool there. Off come the spacers, and that will now allow me to take out this chain set. Quite tight in here, quite firm fit into the bearings. It's a press fit, so it wasn't anything untoward, but we can now remove the chain rings off of this one. You can see on the back here there's a little bit of debris, most notable on the small ring actually on this one, which is why I wanted to take that off to get that apart. So I'm now going to take the rear brake off. You can see there the cable we are replacing, but we're also going to clean the actual caliper itself. So we will put a cable guide into the frame so that when we put the new cable in, it just make our job a little bit easier. So we'll feed that old cable out now, get that through the frame with the cable guide, leave that in the frame while we do the rest of the work, and that will just help us to put a new cable in. So out comes the old cable out of the hood, and then I'm going to remove the front brake. Again, I'm going to keep the cable. Nothing wrong with most of the cables on this bike. Everything was working and actuating as it should, so we will remove the component without cutting the cable, which is what we did there. You can see it's building up debris on the front brake here. Again, we want to clean all that debris off because that will gradually build up, stop that component working nicely, so it's important to clean everything before we lubricate it. Now I'm going to take that chain set apart. You can see the smaller ring there is quite debris infused, so that's why I want to split these down so that I can really work between the two chain rings to make sure that everything there is absolutely spotlessly clean when it goes back on the bike. Jockey wheels are coming out of the derailleur. I'll clean those separately. This particular style has a bearing inside each jockey wheel. I don't want to flush it out with degreaser or with ultrasonic cleaning. I want that to remain lubricated. This is our general service, it's not an in-depth service this one, so we don't want to go too mad on the cleaning process. Just get everything nice, everything lubricated correctly and working as it should. So once the components have been through the ultrasonic cleaner, I left those in there for about a quarter of an hour. I then washed that degreaser off of the component So that's what I'm doing here. So everything's washed off with warm soapy water. All the components that we've put through the ultrasonic cleaner and other components we will wash down in this nature. Then we will dry them with a microfiber towel, blow them out with an airline, get in all the little gritty areas with an airline to really dry that out and make sure these components are completely dry before I lubricate them. Pedal arm there, we just wash that down. Now just note by the L on that writing on the back there's a score mark on there. That's a problem that we're going to solve during this service. The reason why was the front derailleur cable was rubbing against that, so we'll make sure that we shorten that when we put the derailleur on. Now I'm just using a degreaser, spray degreaser on the jockey wheels to really clean those up before I put them back onto the bike, and that way I don't have to worry too much about the bearing being damaged in the centre. And then we're just using a little bit of the thread locker on the pivots for these jockey wheels before putting them back into the derailleur. So that's the guide pulley there, and then we'll do the tension pulley at the bottom here. Next up, I'm going to lubricate this component, so I'm using our premium grease there on the spring, and then I'm using our general purpose oil on the pivot points of the derailleur. These are in general self-lubricating, but as they wear, it's never a bad practice to actually lubricate them with a nice thin oil, which is what we're doing there. This is our copper grease here, anti-seize grease that we're putting on the threads of the chainring bolts. These oils and greases that we use, they're all available on our website. We do a pack of 5 of these or individually for a top up. So it's a great way of supporting the channel if you go over to our website and have a look at our lubricants and various things we sell on the website. The link is always in the description below. And like I say, it's the only way we finance the channel, so it's always supporting us if you do that. Next up, I'm going to put this chain set back together. I'll put the general purpose grease on the splines of the spider itself. So you can see there that smaller ring, which was caked in grease and debris, is now spotlessly clean. And that was what I was attempting to do by taking this apart, was make sure that there was no grit inside the cogs that would wear and damage the chain. I'm going to torque these up to make sure that they're in their final position before it goes on the bike, and then I know that when I do the adjustments to this component, the front derailleur, it will all be in the right place. So again, our premium grease on the spring, and then our general purpose oil on the pivots of the front derailleur. Very happy there now. And then the brakes also have a little bit of work to do. So first of all, I'm using our general purpose grease on the thumb adjuster, and then I will also lubricate the pivot point of this brake. Brakes often seize in the center point just here. They'll often need a little lubrication, so we do that with the service to make sure that everything's okay there. And then I'm just using our silicone grease here on the slider of the spring that slides through a little fitting on the brake there to enable that actuation to be very smooth. Same with skewers, often missed in a service. The quick release there I did with our general purpose oil, the shaft general purpose grease, and then the threads our anti-seize copper grease on the threads there. So there's 3 different lubricating processes on that one component, but that's now ready to be refitted and will make getting the wheels on and off far easier. Now I'm going to wash the bike down. I always like to present my bikes nicely. I like them to be visually serviced, and one of the only ways that most customers can visually see that a bike has been serviced is the fact that it comes back to them clean. It doesn't matter what level of service I'm doing, I will always wash the frame down, which is what I'm doing here. But we're just using our big softy nylon bristle brush there to wash this frame down with, and warm soapy water before, again as in the other processes, I will dry this down with a brand new microfiber towel, which you can see there. That will really pull this water back off the frame to dry it out, and then I'll again use my airline to make sure this frame is completely dry and free of any residue. Now I'm going to concentrate on the wheel. So initially I'm degreasing the hub using one of our nylon detailing brushes there just to clean that off. It was actually greased, so that was actually quite a good thing really. This had been previously greased before the cassette was put on, which is never bad practice, so I was just cleaning that off for a fresh grease in there. Next up I'm going to wash the wheel. I'm looking at things like the braking track here. I make sure that that's nice and clean. I'll inspect that as well as I'm washing. I'm checking that the spokes are all feeling at the right tensions and that everything there is okay. and then once I'm happy, I'll then dry that off with a microfiber towel, similar process to everything else, before I will re-lubricate the hub before putting the cassette on. So I work my grease around there. You don't need it too thick, just to stop any bonding in the future. On goes this brand new cassette, lovely cassette this one. And then once the lock ring's on here, I will also torque that up before putting the quick release through. And then the other thing I'm going to do is to rotate the logo of the tyre over the valve. Reason for that is twofold. One is that it presents the bike nicely to the customer, and the second is that when you're out and about, if you've got a puncture at say the 1 o'clock position and you fix that and then you reoccurring punctures in the same position, you know to look where in the tyre to solve the reason for that puncture. So it's good practice to always have a logo over the valve so as you can really diagnose any issues with the tyre or the tube if you get them. Inflate that now. So once that's inflated, I can then get that back on the bike and everything there is absolutely as it needs to be. So we'll just put a new valve cap onto there, and now we can start the process of rebuilding the bike. So I'm using a premium grease here to just lubricate that chain set as it goes in through the bike, just helps it slide in before we put the spacers back on and then the pedal arm. As mentioned with the chain rings, I will also, once I've done this up, actually put the torque wrench on it to get everything there finalized before putting that front derailleur on. I am going to use a little bit of our anti-seize grease on the pedals. That will just stop those bonding into that arm, make it easier to replace or take them out for the next service. So it will just stop those bonding in. And we also do these to a set torque because they can easily be over tightened. So we want to make sure that that's absolutely perfect. On goes the front derailleur. We'll torque the mount on that one, and I'll also torque the pinch bolt on this one. But the rest of the components I generally put on hand tight to get the adjustments right before I'll go through the bike with a torque wrench to get everything in its final position. So the front derailleur there goes on, and you notice the scratch mark on the wording on the back of this chain set. So this is the reason why the tail is scraping across that chain set with every turn. So we're just going to shorten that cable off, put a new cable end on there so that we're not going to get that continuation of damage on the back of the pedal arm. And now I'm quite happy that that's clearing perfectly. It's never going to touch that pedal arm again. So another little win during the service. It's those sort of subtleties that I like to find when I am servicing a bike. The rear derailleur hanger was a little bit loose on the frame, so we tightened that up. Again, another good reason for having a bike serviced, all these subtle things that we notice along the way. And we're also going to lubricate the thumb adjuster for the rear derailleur before putting it back into the housing itself. And that will again just enable us to continue to be able to adjust this bike during riding without any problems of that bonding and seizing into the derailleur. So we pop the rear derailleur cable back on. That's now okay, and then I'm now going to address this rear brake cable and fit a new one. So first thing I'm going to do is remove the handlebar tape. We're actually going to reuse this. Again, we didn't actually get asked or requested to replace the handlebar tape, so we're just going to replace the cable itself and then redo the handlebar tape back onto the bike, so there'll be no issues there. So off comes the tape that holds those cables together and on the bike. Out comes that outer, and then we'll thread in a new super slick brake cable. We always use these lovely stainless steel cables. They're uncoated, they're very tightly wound, they're very smooth, especially for gear shifting. And again, we do sets of these on our website, so please do check that out. We use these on every service. Whenever we're doing a cable, we always use our own super slick cables. They are a cracking cable for any shifting really or braking. Very nice cables. So back on goes the handlebar tape, and then I'll refinish the end of that just tucked up here. We'll also do the opposite side with a similar finish so that you're not really aware as a rider that we've actually changed anything there. Once that's on, we can then feed the cable back through the frame using that guide that we put in when we took it off. Makes this job a lot easier. And then the next issue for me is to fit the rear brake. So again, I'm using our copper anti-seize grease in the frame. They often bond into the frame, those fittings, so we're trying to avoid that happening. And then on goes the tail. Now this tail is actually slightly shorter than the one that came off, and the reason for that is these Sram brakes are very easy to turn on their own counterweight. So if that's too long, it will actually push the brake across. and that was actually happening on this bike. There was a slight rub on the brake pad, so we made sure that that won't happen again by shortening that cable out at just that slight amount. On goes the front brake now. The back brake I'm quite happy with, so we'll just do up that front brake, and then we will do the same as with the rear brake, where we will lubricate the adjuster before putting it back into the brake caliper itself. Again, nothing wrong with this cable, so we just pop that one back in. Do up the thumb adjuster, which is now lubricated nicely, will be easier to use out on the road and for minor adjustments that are ever needed. And then we can set the wheel back in the frame. So once the wheels are in the frame, I will adjust up those calipers to make sure they're braking evenly on the braking surface of the wheel itself, test those brakes, and then we can now put the new chain onto the drivetrain. So on goes the new chain with the quick link there. Just click that shut, and then once that's on the bike, I can shift through the gears. And I did notice something here. When we got up into first gear, I realised that the B screw was actually wound fully home on the derailleur. I've never seen that before. It's wound completely in. You can see there the jockey wheel of the derailleur coming closer to the cassette on the wheel. That will give us a much more positive shift. It just makes a world of difference to the shifting if the B screw is set in the correct position. Front derailleur is okay. Now you can see there the brakes themselves are spot on. So we've got good shifting, good braking, and I'm quite happy with the way this bike is coming together. So now I'm going to run through the bike with a torque wrench and make sure that everything is at its set torque. Hoods are always loose. Every time I service a bike, I have to do these up. They're always loose. Now the crown bolts for the stem, they're actually okay on the top, but the bottom two were slightly loose. You can see here that moving. So we need to get that right. And then the other issue we had with this bike was the pre-tension on the headset bearings was completely loose. We could turn that. That shouldn't be like that. That will enable the headset bearing to move around, float around on the frame. That can cause damage to the bearings and the frame. Likewise, where this stem meets the steerer tube, we can get a ring forming around that steerer tube that will cause it to fracture. So we don't want that to happen. So we'll tighten all the preload on the bearing. And it will also make the bike slightly more stable in the cornering, because you won't have any of that vibration coming up through the wheel. So this was a very important thing for this service to have spotted, that stem was loose, and to make sure the preload was correct on the bearing itself. So I continue now with the torque wrench to torque up the brakes, make sure that the brake pads are tight, make sure that the mount is correctly torqued. So everything there on the front end is now perfect. Obviously we've done most of the center, but we haven't done the pedals, so we'll just torque those up along the way. I torque those against the tire. It's just a nice easy way of doing it. And then I will also check the saddle. Saddles are always loose. Seat posts are always loose. So you can see there the seat post was in fact loose on this bike, and the saddle actually wasn't too bad, but it did need a torque along with this back brake now. So we just torque that up as well. Again, the mount, so we're just holding that with the spanner one side and the mount the other, and then the rear derailleur, so the mount of that and the pinch bolt. And now everything on the bike is as it should be. But the final job for me to do is to tighten up the bottle cages. Riv nuts are often loose in frames, so I always do those by hand. I don't do those with a torque wrench. I do those by feel alone. So you can see here on the before and afters, we've made a great difference to this bike. Everything's now cleaned up. Everything's now lubricated as it should be. Everything's tightened as it should be. New chain and cassette, new rear brake cable. This bike is now going to be $1 million compared to where it was when it came in. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe. Drop us a comment about your recent service, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.